Okay, it's noon and we're going to resume. I think we have Alex Herrgott here in person, and I'll wait till everybody settles down. And I think we have Colleen ready on the remote. So there is probably no bigger issue that affects more elected officials, whether it's at local level like Prince George or state legislator or MLA in Canada or Congress, members of Congress or members of the parliament. There's no bigger issue than the challenge we have with expediting project delivery and trying to disentangle the Byzantine world of permits so that we can accelerate transportation energy projects in the Northwest. In our work at the Regional Accelerator, we provide technical assistance to small jurisdictions, tribal governments, ports, small cities about how to navigate the massive IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was put in place by Biden administration and Congress. Now we're transitioning to a new infrastructure law. We're going to hear more about that tomorrow. But besides the challenges we have with supply chains that we've heard about this morning, which most Americans and Canadians first started to understand what supply chains were when the pandemic hit and they couldn't get diapers or formula, and then the grocery stores shelves were empty. So all of a sudden people started to understand supply chain challenges. And then inflation in construction costs has bedeviled our major projects, but it's the paperwork and the application for federal grants that we heard about from small jurisdictions. The notice of funding opportunity used to be 7 or 10 pages. Now then it became 30 pages, all kinds of questions. So fast tracking the, getting money out the door to local jurisdictions is really critical. And then with permit reform, it's an issue that has been incrementally addressed. I can only speak for the U.S. by successive administrations in Congress, going back to the second Bush administration through Obama and Trump and Biden. And we're going to hear from Alex about this. We have incrementally tried to improve the permit process, but with not a lot of success. In the last couple of years, there has emerged, and this is very important, a Republican and Democratic consensus to expedite projects and streamline the permit system. When the Trump administration, for instance, pulled the hydrogen hub funding, Governor Kotek here in Oregon said we're going to fast track our clean energy projects in Oregon. So you get this, this push and pull, but the timing in politics is critical, and we're at a great time right now. So Alex Herrgott, and I won't go through his resume, but 16 years basically in writing the last transportation bill on environment and public works. He's with the Permitting Council. In the first Trump administration, he was in the White House on federal permits. So he's in an ideal position to walk us through what is going on as we speak in Washington, D.C., and trying to come up with a bipartisan consensus to move permit reform forward. And then Colleen Giroux-Schmidt is joining us from Innergex. Colleen spoke at our Bellevue Summit, very impressive. She's been with Innergex for 11 years, and she's really emerged as a leading Canadian voice on green energy. And she talked very eloquently about the need to coordinate permitting in Canada and the U.S. on these cross-border transportation energy projects. So I'm really excited to hear from both Alex and Colleen about not only what we can do as PNWER, but what we can do in terms of the same message to Washington, D.C. and to Ottawa in terms of the necessity to fix this problem. So Alex, you want to start?
So 5 minutes, Bruce? What do you think?
We've given you A lot of time, Alex, because we know you like to talk.
Well, I think thanks for inviting me. This is my first time at PNWER, so I appreciate it. It's not just the folks in this room, the folks that are watching, and the state legislators. The reason why it's important to travel from DC and come out into the field or go to the Washington Public Utility District's meeting next week, or to travel, is the folks that are actually in charge of the assets, the people that put the capital at risk, the ones that are not just in charge of the original capital that may come from the feds, but are responsible for the long-term deferred maintenance, the interaction with the communities, the obligations on the continuing conversations that need to happen where infrastructure or freight, which doesn't vote, continues to compete with the other funding responsibilities and the pressures that happen as state legislators navigate the public good, right? And now we are at this intersection where, although I have worked on highways, surface transportation, and energy my whole life, as a staff director of the Environment Public Works Committee in the Senate, starting back with the 2005 Safety Lou bill, where then I was in charge of earmarks and had to put something called the Bridge to Nowhere in a bill. I also had permitting as my responsibility, so I also had to figure out how to build it faster. So moving forward, and then over at my time at the White House as the first executive director of the Federal Permitting Council, which I can talk about because it's important for a lot of reasons, is that injecting common sense into the infrastructure debate has been something that I've never really understood why it was politicized. At the end of the day, you're talking about gas taxes, you're talking about transportation, inflation funds, property taxes. On average, the American family pays anywhere between $150 to $180 a year in federal gas taxes, right? And at the state level, Washington, Oregon, Montana, elsewhere, it's about the same. Yet you will pay $200 for an electricity bill or $100 for waste and sewer. And so what we have is a situation where everyone has relied on the legacy investments of 40 or 50 years ago, but we haven't paid for them. And we are now at a situation where the things that we have counted on to support the physical platform of our economy have reached a point where they're not only be well beyond their useful life, but they're also at capacity. And so we're at a standstill. We're at an absolute standstill. The permitting regimes, of which I know there's a picture that was on the bio that is one that I wrote for President Trump, but it basically was the schematic and the architecture of how we actually permit projects. That's once it gets to the federal side. On the state and local side, and something that Bruce has worked on quite a bit, from concept to completion, you're working on a project 2-3 years, building the basis for it, the groundswell of support, developing the capital, working with your private partners before you ever file an application. By that time, on average right now, for a rail, surface transportation, transit, pipeline, and now especially that's coming to the forefront with data centers and elsewhere, before you even submit an application for review at the federal level, you're well over $200,000 just in engineering, and that's conservative for a project of $50 or $100 million. 10% of those projects make it to the next level. The rest are left on the drawing board. Where does that money go? It's gone. And because those that we provide the infrastructure for see infrastructure as a public good and never want to pay the true cost of it because we haven't communicated. And when I talk about this chart on the right, that was when I was at the White House. That is just, I could bring the whole chart, but it'd be like 20 feet tall. That's just the first 3 years, right? Dealing with just getting through DOT before you even get to the Army Corps of Engineers, before you get to the Fish and Wildlife Service, before you get to the coastal zone management rules that are actually governed by the state, or the State Clean Water Act 401, which is governed by the state. Then you have to intersect with the Army Corps of Engineers 404 process, which the state 401 process feeds up into, but if the Corps doesn't agree with the state's methodology and modeling, that could be anywhere between 5 to 30 years old, since many of these rules were written well before the internet. And when I say well before the internet, we're talking a century ago, the Rivers and Harbors Act, 1973, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act. Because of the hyperbole in Washington, D.C., these have largely gone unamended, unmodernized for 30 to 40 years. They became these silos that we just didn't touch. We have endangered species right now that are creating a mitigation requirement, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where significant riparian sensitivities that are being mitigated for, that by no means should still be listed as endangered. By no means. Yet they're being used as a litigation foothold to stop a project, and that's not from an environmental community, it's from competitors or from NIMBYs or from others. So just to call out the fact that building projects is zero sum on cultural, historic, or environmental resources would be a misnomer. Faster doesn't mean less protections for the environment. It doesn't mean less protections for environmental stewardship. What it means is the process has become so lethargic that it now costs 20 to 30% of total project cost. For any project over $100 million in the US, 20 to 30% right out the door, right out the door. It doesn't help that because of the overlapping requirements, as many as 13 federal agencies, 6 state, 5 local, independent of anything else that you need to worry about, is that the environmental documents that an AECOM or a WSP or a Stantec have put together, they're giving their C-suite at the companies, they're giving the states, they're giving port directors exactly what they want, which is an overbuilt, bulletproof application. Those applications, not only just on the grant side to apply for a infra grant or a mega grant or one of these big DOT grants, which I'll talk about because there's a lot of opportunities there, that now cost $50,000 just to get the application ready to go with benefit cost ratios and critical freight corridor analysis and modeling that differs between region and locality. The actual environmental review document now, which used to be $5 million, $10 million to put together, on average is now $40 to $50 million. And it has bells and whistles on it, not because they're required by feds or because you're trying to circumvent environmental rules. It's because you, as a C-suite, let's say you're a BNSF and you're putting together a rail bridge and you're doing a double stacking so that you can actually increase capacity. You need to do a grade realignment that's going to cost this much, and you got to do this much modeling. You're not only just writing an application for the project you want that's in your project design envelope, you're also fighting against obstacles that haven't even been created yet. Issues that haven't even been generated yet. So you have to look 5 years into the future and say, this might be an issue. We should protect for that. We should model for that. How do you model for things that haven't been created yet? There are questions that I take on 7 counties and some of these big decisions that happen in the US, but when you talk about permitting, there's a reason why I didn't get married later in life. Is because permitting is very boring, it's very technical, and sometimes it's not very relatable. But it is the single biggest unforced error, not only in the US, but with our partners in Canada, that we can actually fix. This is not gun control, right? This is not some social issue with entrenched people. This is putting capital at risk to build things smarter and honor the equities, not only of our tribal communities, but our environmental stewardship. And we are at a level now with large language processing and AI where we can inject transparency into this debate. So those that are fighting in the doldrums, like Bruce and many in these rooms, we've had many conversations about this, no longer have to sit in dark corners at an AASHTO event trying to fight out why this rail project is so damn important, right? Or the displacement impact that this rail is gonna have on trucks and the drayage coming out of Port of Tacoma or Seattle, or what's gonna happen to Rupert, where we don't have to fight against the ILA on negotiating a different contract that's actually gonna significantly impact the US's ability to move freight, which then allows China to buy up most of Mexico on mineral processing and pipelines. So to take a step back, it is opportunity and optimism. Every 5-6 years, we have a large scale infrastructure bill in the United States. It's what I've spent most of my life working on. It's what I did at the White House. It's what I did in the Senate. It's why the Permitting Institute, which is now what I work at, is a nonprofit pro-development trade association. Think about a chamber of commerce that likes to build things, and it will fight in the shadows if we need to, with many of the former feds and project developers that have written some of the largest environmental impact statements in the history of our country. They're the unelected bureaucrats that are the ones that push things over the finish line, right? Similar to when we were working on A2A, when we flew up to Anchorage, and then we're working with Meade and others, and we're trying to figure out a way in which to create a package. So whether it's President Biden or whether it's a presidential permit issue with my former boss, President Trump, who still to this day calls me Alan, even though he knows it's Alex, but he says I should have corrected him in the first 6 months, and that's what I get. So when it comes to Cascadia or some of the Pacific Northwest, on the rail corridor, what very similar as when we were talking about ports to plane and others, is that this whole USMCA, what will happen with Canada, what will happen with the US, what we're going to see, and why this highway bill is so important, is that our North American partners are going to start to see that the three of us, these countries that make up this large economic bloc, are unified more in a way than they ever have been before, right? And that recognition is going to come full speed with Secretary Duffy from Appleton, Wisconsin, that gets most of the aluminum extruding imports right over the border, or Enbridge, or Synovus, or many of these companies where there is no real line between the 60 pipeline crossings, the 5 freight crossings up in the Pacific Northwest, and the port expansion, and how there is not a zero-sum impact on Prince Rupert growth versus like Port of Oakland exports, right? The amount of exports and on both cargo, freight, and on bulk, we're at a situation where Canada wins, US wins, right? We are not in a zero-sum nature here. This highway bill, IIJA in 2000, President Trump took over in 2000, when he took over in 2016, 17, a highway bill, the FAST Act, which I worked on, spent many times on my couch working on it. We built up the infra program, the freight program, a refocus on the interstate, the Fed's responsibility to capital investments that would then help states and localities and our international partners go to their electorate and get matching dollars, increase the ability to inject Fed capital dollars that would then allow the deferred long-term maintenance responsibilities at the state and local level to be easier, right? IIJA, in large part, focused more on resiliency and removing that obligation from states and localities on long-term deferred maintenance, which took away a lot of the capital to build these large new projects that we need to build out the physical platform of our economy. Next August, the IIJA expires. Right now, in my work with DOT and over at the White House, and then with the former colleagues that used to work for me, working in the House and the Senate, are already putting together the bones of what that bill will be. And that refocus will be on how do we use this bill to redefine infrastructure for the next 20, 30, 40 years, right? Create that capital infrastructure, create the induced demand for sovereign wealth funds, foreign direct investment, public-private partnerships, by giving clarity and transparency and regulatory certainty to capital that is being put at risk. Because at the end of the day, in the United States in particular, unlike countries in Europe, who is putting up the capital to build those projects? It's either taxpayers or it's private companies. And outside of the rail context, why would you put capital at risk to build out a rail line, build out capacity on an auxiliary line, coordinate with the data centers and the pipeline guys to create new corridors like in Montana and elsewhere, or go from Edmonton to Alaska and build out our networks there, if you don't know if your ROI is going to be there, or if the commitment's going to be there, or whether or not you're in a black box of permitting where you can't share with your shareholders that you just lost 20 to 30% of your original investment on wasted permitting delays that have nothing to do with environmental protection, but have to do with an outdated system that can't talk to each other. So, highway bill. Not only are we at a crossroads where large language processing, AI, and the modernization of our communication and basically our transparency networks are going to allow all of this investment to be something that we can see in real time. No more black box. And then you take into account that states have the ability for very modest expenses at the beginning of their legislatures, beginning next year, to mimic what is done at the federal level on state permitting councils, or the ability to, in real time, track not only the application from the front end, but the entire process of capital that is being put at risk. What you'll see at that point is the debt and equity markets are going to throw their hands up and start pouring money into the states. Absolutely will happen. We don't need to force public-private partnerships when at the end of the day, they're like, just tell us where the investment goes. Tell us where the investment goes so the default and abandonment risk of projects isn't as high as it is now, which is right around 12, 13, 14, 15%. So you're paying for a financing cost for the unpredictability of whether or not the project will actually get built. And then separately, it should not cost you 20% of the grant that you're applying for to apply for the damn grant. It just shouldn't. You do not need, if you're applying for federal dollars for grants, it should not be the Herculean undertaking for states and localities and counties to put together something that we just don't need. We know where the good projects are. We have an entire system that is built on a legacy paper-based system that is no longer operational. So the rules that govern how we play in this infrastructure space, we allow ourselves to think back, 5, 10, 15 years ago. 12 years ago, I don't think I had an iPhone, right? If I walked into DOT 5 years ago and I talked to Gloria Shepard or today, Sean McMaster, and I go, how many environmental assessments or FRA? And I go talk to Marlis in the environmental office, and I ask her how many EISs or EAs or RPAs are currently moving through the system, and what about the high-speed rail that's moving through Vancouver? I'm trying to think where that project is, but they wouldn't know, and it would take them months to track it down. So if the people on the inside don't even know where projects are in the system, how are people on the outside supposed to know? And then when an issue happens or an election happens, you kind of throw your hands up and go, well, we're working it. I love attorneys and consultants. I love them. They hate me, but I love them at this point, because the quiet truth that nobody wants to talk about is the money that is raised from your electorate or from gas taxes or in that negotiation with the community that BNSF might have about a grade separation for safety and throughput and sound and speed issues that will have to start 6 miles back before the actual intersection. And they're pushing the county or the city to kick in 50%. Those conversations have been revolving around a false premise. And the false premise is that we cannot build things better and faster in this country without the consequences that are purported. Countries like Canada, far greener than the US, as they would say, great, still take a significant amount of time to build projects. Denmark, Germany, Norway, we wrote a report on this, they can build a pipeline in 3 months. In 3 months. So the Green New Deal, the way in which modern environmentalism is built on, and keep in mind, this is not a Republican or a Democrat idea, because now the impacts on not addressing an archaic, outdated process are hurting wind and solar projects from IRA far worse than they're ever hurting any pipeline project in the history of our country. Couldn't get them out the door, couldn't use the IRA money, and now that problem is shared pain on both sides. This is no longer a Republican-Democrat issue. It is no longer a tribes versus the state issue. It is economic growth, build faster, and you do that, and you keep it transparent, then everything else falls into place. And it's not just the feds, it's the states. The states can actually pick up where the feds left off with the state permitting councils, that the federal permitting council creating a Gantt chart, tracking a project, and actually do that for any number of sectors at any level of project, and the level of induced investment and confidence is going to go off the charts. As I tell Bruce, I'm talking at you, but I brought 50 cards. The reason why is because we at the Permitting Institute, and I have people traveling around the country now, realize that it is not just about speeches, right? It's about pulling our sleeves up and working to actually address and approach this new authorization window that is going to happen in 12 months and change the way in which we actually do business rather than just fighting about the gas tax. That is not going to be a debate that's going to be had this time around. So what is going to define the next reauthorization of the single largest federal investment in infrastructure in the United States in 14 months before that bill expires? And what I can tell you is it's an opportunity that hasn't arisen in quite some time. So Bruce, I want to kick it over, but I also want to save some time for Q&A, but there's a lot there. And then you can tell me the things that I missed. But at the end of the day, optimism, it's what I got right now. Real optimism, not fake, real.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'd like to thank Bruce and thank Alex for his remarks. And I'm coming to you today from British Columbia, from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kwik-Witlam. I thank the Kwik-Witlam who continue to live on these lands and care for them, along with the waters and all that is above and below. And in the context of our discussion on both permitting and infrastructure investment, taking a long time horizon, like many of our Indigenous colleagues do, is critical. As Bruce mentioned, I've spent now 2 decades in navigating the permitting process for major infrastructure projects across Canada. And just to give you some more background on the context I'm bringing with me into this discussion today, Innergex is a Canadian renewable energy developer. We have utility scale hydro, wind, solar operating across Canada. We also have solar storage, solar, wind, and hydro operating across the United States. Wind, solar, hydro, and storage operating in Chile, and wind and storage operating in France. So we've seen a lot of different versions of permitting, good, bad, and ugly, if you will. So from this perspective, it's already been mentioned, but uncertain timelines and delays add cost and decrease the certainty that this critical infrastructure, whether it's electricity, transmission lines, moving into roads, highways, and all the things we think of traditionally as our infrastructure. That hurts everybody. It doesn't just hurt the developer. It ultimately hurts the economy and the society that we're trying to have thrive as we go forward. Developers or project proponents, as with everyday citizens and interest groups, care about the environment. Nobody wants to sacrifice the standards that we have. But the issue we're seeing right now is that time doesn't equal rigor, and that we have, no matter where on the continent you're looking at, we have a lot of antiquated rules and regulations. Many of our legislative frameworks were built in the 19th century or earlier part of the 20th century, and they don't reflect 21st century values and objectives. They also haven't been very nimble in adjusting, as we've seen, Alex mentioned species being protected that no longer need the protection. In the context of PNWER, we also have species that don't understand geopolitical boundaries and might span right across the Pacific Northwest. And each individual subnational jurisdiction is trying to provide 100% of the protections for them. So that doesn't make sense, and there's a lot of room for optimization. What we're starting to see now across the political rhetoric, and we appreciate this as an acknowledgement that time and the delays it's taking is a barrier that we need to move through. But I just wanted to share some perspectives on why this needs to be deeper than announcement about a simpler process, because we've seen many of those over the past 20 years. Our experience is that what ultimately is causing delay beyond the antiquated legislation is that over time, decision makers have become increasingly risk adverse, and the culture around making decisions on behalf of government has become less tolerant to moving forward. And so when you're paralyzed by, I don't want to end up in a lawsuit, I don't want to make a bad decision, I don't want to carry accountability for this decision, that's where delay comes in. And this quest for I need more information here, I need more information there, and then that starts to spin. Lack of communication between different levels of government also can create a lot of delays. So whether that's between the two nations, between the federal governments and the subnational level governments, and between the provincial or state governments and local government, there's all sorts of room for gap and duplication and lack of clarity on who's making the decision. We've also seen increasingly now, certainly on the Canadian side of the border, Indigenous nations are leading their own permitting process or getting much more involved in the governance of major projects. But that also can cause another layer of duplication that we need to be mindful of. At the end of the day, one clear set of requirements that we can move through with the appropriate professionals quickly, and then clarity on decisions quickly, will allow shovels in the ground faster. And again, this infrastructure that we're building is to be the foundation for a thriving economy and society in the decades to come. Another observation or thought I wanted to share today is that this isn't a short-term thing. We need to be thinking about today the infrastructure that we're going to need for decades to come. So that means, and I'll use the example of wind turbines, which is what we're actively developing at Innergex here in British Columbia. And for folks that aren't aware, the blades now on wind turbines are 90 meters long, which is a pretty significant piece of physical infrastructure to move through our ports, on our railways, on our highways to project sites. That's a football field minus one end zone. And the blades are also getting larger. And so as we're thinking about what improvements do we need to have to rail, port, roads to facilitate the development of the next 5 years, what could it also be for the next 15, 20, 25, so that we're not having to continue to reinvest in upgrading infrastructure over time. The other thing that we're seeing increasingly as well, I won't talk again about that deficit in infrastructure investment because Alex has spoken to it already, but it's also the need to rebuild and harden our infrastructure as we're experiencing a rapidly changing climate and increased fire risk, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And so how do we make sure that the infrastructure we're building, either as state governments investing, provincial governments investing, or the private sector, like Innergex investing, we want to make sure that it's durable and able to be there for decades to come. I think the last thought that I will leave folks with is that we don't have a risk of overbuilding at this moment. I think sometimes we get concerned. Is it too much? How much do we need tomorrow? We have to, again, look at this over a multi-decade time horizon. North America has significant opportunity to shine, and we won't be able to build fast enough all the infrastructure we require to get there. And from the electricity perspective, what this is punctuated dramatically by the increase in artificial intelligence and data centers, what those needs are to make sure we have the support for that onshore in North America, and the electricity needed to underpin it. So I will leave some time here for questions, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So Colleen, let me start with you. At the Bellevue PNWER Summit, you talked about the opportunities to develop a cross-border regime for permitting. And this morning we've talked about pipelines, transmission lines, highways, railroads, crossing the border. As I understand it, it usually requires a presidential permit from the State Department. But in terms of coordinating the review of that project, do you envision some sort of Canadian-U.S. panel that would coordinate that overview? Is question one. Question two, the Prime Minister has launched this major projects initiative to fast track projects throughout Canada to make, particularly for the export market. In that initiative, is there expedited project delivery and faster track for permitting as part of that investment strategy?
Yeah, so for the first question on cross-border coordination, I think yes, but with the caveat, the most important thing is having clarity of each respective government's requirements at the beginning, one set of information collection to support it, and then clarity on the decision making. And again, recognizing that's not a small feat, as each nation has its own sovereign interests it needs to support, but clarity on the requirements and consistency on them and durability of what those requirements are through the process. One of the, I guess, the destroyers of a project timeline is a last minute information request for something that's new that can bubble up from one of the governments involved. With respect to the major project office that Canada's launched, we're still in the early days, so optimistic that it's going to be an office that can expedite project approvals. We're hopeful, based on our experience recently in British Columbia, where the government moved to have the permitting for major electricity projects moved from the potpourri of different government agencies to the BC Energy Regulator, where one regulator is going to administer the decisions on behalf of the government. So there's still the same set of legislation and requirements that there was before, but instead of having multiple decision makers and multiple groups you have to work through, there's just one central location. So again, it's early days, but we're optimistic this is going to provide a more certain and faster path forward. And again, to punctuate, time doesn't equal rigor. And so faster permitting process, it doesn't mean a less thorough one. It just means we're getting rid of some of the bureaucratic inefficiencies.
All right, thank you. And one of the things that was announced a couple of weeks ago, and Alex, maybe you can address this, under the, as I understand it, project or process called Fast 41, which was part of the FAST Act, allows the Federal Permitting Council and a governor of the state to enter an MOU to actually fast track specific projects. To date, Alaska's Governor Dunleavy has been the only one to do that, although we understand Idaho and Montana are looking at it, the governor's office. What's your perspective on that?
My perspective is that oftentimes states, doesn't matter whether it's a Democratic governor or Republican, oftentimes I don't want to engage with this new federal office. I don't understand. Our process is fine, and we may not even need a large-scale environmental impact statement, but that would be something I would strongly discourage against. It's a one-way valve. A state that waves into this federal permitting council, which is funded significantly by IIJA and which is doing mining projects, solar, wind, broadband, fiber. In fact, was responsible for the single largest investment in wind and solar in the history of our country, which happened during the Trump administration, not the Biden and Obama administrations combined, was because it was about certainty and clarity. But what it removed was duplication and replication. State data, state categorical exclusions, state habitat and species data. And so when Alaska waves in, they're essentially taking all of their state processes, which are many, Coastal Zone Management, Clean Water Act, and lining them up alongside on one Gantt chart so they're all tracked in unanimity at the federal level. What that is going to do is take years off the process. It's going to inoculate from litigation risk, and it's going to transcend election risk for projects that will extend far beyond this presidential administration into the next, because projects have a long tail. States should actively be engaging with the Federal Permitting Council, Emily Dominic, the executive director, who Bruce knows, because there are money and there are resources very similar to Regional Accelerator to wave in and become and sign these MOUs, which at the end of the day, you can jump off an MOU at any time you want, right? So those kinds of actions are what companies and what investment is looking at, that kind of certainty.
Okay, the next question has to do with the politics of today. You mentioned the reauthorization, the House Transportation Committee, of which PNWER has 4 members. They take the first crack at the bill in the House, and then it goes to 3 committees in the Senate. Our Northwest delegation is perfectly poised in positions of leadership, either as a chair of the key authorizing appropriations committee or the ranking minority. But putting that aside, and right now the government is shut down. The tariff wars continue. The critical minerals debate with China and the U.S. continues. You're part of these discussions in the White House and at the U.S. DOT about how we get back to infrastructure and energy dominance and permitting reform. When is that going to happen? Does all this stuff have to die down first? And then once the government gets back into business and we get back to looking at appropriations authorization bills, is that when this happens, or is this continuing despite the politics that kind of surround us?
So I will say there's this old there's this thing that I used to read about. It was generals from Nazi Germany that were talking about how to suppress other nations, and it was like create more meetings, create more criteria. It was the same. I was reading it again. I usually use it in opening of permitting discussions, but when you look at the freight program that was generated, the critical freight program, the infra grants, they were not meant to have all of this other criteria. The TIFIA program, those kinds of things. What you will see is that when the requirements are taken off, it gives the states more flexibility to harness what they is the largest priority and the largest economic engine. So when we talk about reauthorization and the softening of USMCA, or the softening of some of this US versus rest of the world, as the outside world, in particular Europe and China and others, are engaging with Africa and some other partners in Russia, is that what you are seeing politically is a president who's at the second part of his first, it'll be at the tail end of his second year in a White House in which he is not only fighting against his own party, but has one singular bill next year to focus on, and that is infrastructure and rebuilding the country. That is not the set of politics that existed 5, 6, 7 years ago. It was about gas tax, which he was fine with a 50-cent gas tax at that point. The bill will have earmarks. So much like your old boss, when Alaska Viaduct and some of these other projects, that DeFazio, one of the more impactful legislators in the history of the highway world, along with my boss, Senator Inhofe.
From Eugene, Oregon.
Yeah, who was there for 6 authorizations, I think, is that if states can get on the same page with the projects that they find are the most important. And when I say freight doesn't vote, I'm talking about port expansion capacity as well, right? It's the entire integrated system. This is the window in which, if you focus on the freight and the larger pieces of it, then it's easier for the legislators to fight for the transportation funding that otherwise was significantly substituted by IIJA. As federal capital spending went up, state and local spending went down. It's very hard to bring that back up. If you matched at the federal level, we're talking about generational type investment across all assets, because it is not, and I said this earlier, it is not rail versus pipelines versus trucks anymore. We need them all. Same thing on the energy side. And the fights that the pipeline guys are having, the critical minerals folks, are the same things that all long linear infrastructure is happening. So we have this universe in where the equities of what people are pushing for are going to be reading off the same talking points.
Great. Questions from the audience? Also, I don't have the Hoover questions. I don't know if you guys want to. Yes. First back there and then up to you, Shane. Somebody want to bring a mic over? Hold on, Mike. I got it before you, so re-identify yourself.
Hi, again, I'm Mike Fox from the Hood River White Salmon Bridge Authority, but my background is heavy construction before I retired in 17 worldwide. Question for you, have we learned anything, or what can we learn from what China is doing in their infrastructure projects compared to what we're doing? Is there something that we can learn? Because they're building giga projects, not mega projects, giga projects, and they're doing it very quickly.
So I'm going to have Alex answer that, and then Colleen answer that from the Canadian perspective. Alex?
I'll make it quick. Is that our infrastructure is owned by private citizen and states, and state-sponsored infrastructure. It's very easy to circumvent the very laws that you created while you're doing it, right? So I think in our situation, we have 50 states. We have, if companies do not put capital at risk, if legislators do not put capital at risk, their taxpayers, that project doesn't get built. And that's why it's taking so much time, because you're injecting state, local, and federal politics. China, if it wants to build a pre-stressed, large-scale concrete bridge, it does it within 6 months because it can. We can't even rebuild the Baltimore Bridge, or I'm trying to think of the Minnesota Bridge when it collapsed and I flew up there the next day. That still took us 2.5 years, right, on I-35. So fundamentally, we have one of the best political processes in the world. On a lot of issues, we struggle. On this one, the idea is to make it more of a third rail, where we can all agree that we don't use the rhetoric of the process to stop the kind of energy, whether it be wind or whether it be freight versus rail or versus highway, against the actual investment. Make the process fair for everybody, and then you can fight out the funding battles. We have given, that's why I say it's the greatest unforced error. China doesn't have that issue. They want to build something, they just go ahead and build it, and environmental degradation be damned.
Colleen, do you have a response to that? I don't know if you heard the question.
I did, yeah. And I think what I would add is that collectively it's aligning on what are we trying to do, right? We want to build the infrastructure, and our process right now, the way it's evolved, is we have a whole bunch of questions and discussions on why we shouldn't do it. It's too risky. It could hurt this. This could happen. This could happen. Instead of, looking at it's happening. How do we make it better? Which is what the original intention of a lot of environmental assessment processes were. It wasn't a plebiscite on a project going yes or no. It was how do we make it the best version of itself, minimizing the impacts it'll have. And I think if we can ground back on we all need the infrastructure, we all want it to be built. How do we get to yes? Will be much quicker. Agree the political structure is fundamentally different in China, and that gives them a lot of freedom to go quickly. And I don't know that in North America, sacrificing our process is something we're willing to do, but we can certainly get a lot faster and focused than we are currently.
Okay, one final quick question. When you look at reasons for cost escalation, how would you rate what we've been talking about, regulations, permits? How would you rate that as a priority versus supply chain challenges that we're seeing exacerbated by tariff wars? And the other issue that we're actually going to talk about in the next panel, labor costs, increased labor costs, lack of skilled tradespeople to build things. How would you rate those three? And are they equally problematic in terms of escalating costs, or does one really stand out?
I think
Colleen, you want to start?
Sure. I say all three are what keep me up at night at the moment. And part of that is the length of time we have between when we sign our contract. The way energy procurement works in a lot of places is we lock in a price that we're going to deliver it for before we do the permitting process and then the construction. So you're several years in advance. So that then makes supply chain, the ability to get products and what we have to assume something is going to cost 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now. Getting through permitting, is the timeline going to be held or not to what it says it's going to be? And just the fact that introduces 3 to 5 years creates or exacerbates the risk on the supply chain side. And then labor, again, I think collectively across the region, whether it's on the Canadian side or the American side, we really need to invest in skilled labor, because when you look at all the planned infrastructure projects, there are not the humans here with the skills on the timelines that we need at the scale we need to build it out.
Alex?
I think when it comes to tariffs, the problem is that on the investment side, they're bearing 80% of the responsibility of the downstream impacts, right? If we're able to communicate that this tariff increases this gallon of milk, this level, all the way down to the micro, when you're at the macro, at this point, the alignment of incentives and who actually pays for a tariff is fine if everyone's paying for it, right? And it's integrated throughout the economy. But if it's just a front end steel issue or a Halidex GE wind and solar facility, then that's just going to impede investment on the front end. What I will say is that there will be a softening of USMCA for a lot of reasons, and it's going to be driven by data centers, critical minerals processing in Mexico, and several others. And as a result, that's going to have a spillover benefit on the highway and interconnection side. So although we think in these modal stovepipes and we are in freight, this is the same sort of thing we could have talked about in Bellevue, Washington 6 months ago, which is in general, the comment that Colleen made about we're not at risk of overbuilding is exactly right. We need 50 gigs yesterday of electricity. We're at the highest congestion on the freight on our 44,000 miles of interstate in the history of our country, and it's getting worse. And until people want to put down their iPhone or not drive an EV, there is always going to be trade-offs between human activity and the natural environment. And to ignore that and to still be a part of this machine that they call America or North America is tone deaf, right? And so that is that's a harder position to have, which is we can have no impacts, but we need all this stuff, right? It doesn't work. And I think that you're seeing that you're seeing uncommon bedfellows in the U.S. House and the Senate that are coming together to recognize that. I've seen it in Canada, recognition on the First Nations, especially with Alberta's doing on the Indigenous score and others, where that we don't need to have these traditional fights that soak up so much time and energy and political equity.
We're over time, but I just, permit reform is a matter of political will. I would love to take this 48-minute session we had with Alex and Colleen and share it with every single elected leader in the PNWER region, because it was really, really impressive. Thank you.